I've sketched out an outline for the drawing with an HB pencil onto rough watercolour paper, 12 by 14 inches. I put some washi tape around the border, which will give me a nice white border once I finish the painting. A really nice way of presenting your work if you're not going to frame it. So I've mixed up Cerulean and some yellow, Hansa yellow medium, with a pinch of the Cerulean and some quinacridone gold. This is my first stage, so I'm working wet into wet, and I'm going to paint pale washes over the entire painting. I kind of want to get the background in there, so the sky, I want to get that blue cerulean sky there before I start painting more details in the trees. So I'm painting wet into wet with a large mop brush here, and that's just the cerulean on its own. I'm just painting the patches of sky, and it's sort of spreading. The good thing about using blue for the sky, if you're painting trees, blue and yellow make green, so don't worry about the blue contaminating the green foliage. So I'm just painting it sort of halfway down, and now I'm just mixing up a little bit of raw sienna and some yellow for the fence on the right hand side. I actually took this photograph. The thing that I really loved about the photograph was the light and the lovely texture of those sort of foliage and the trees, etc. So I've painted some raw sienna in the foreground, and now I'm painting a yellow green here, and this is the light in the distance. This is wet into wet, still with a large brush, but just painting this yellow green just here and there where I can see the lighter areas to begin with. That is my focal point, the light in the sort of middle distance there. So just painting sort of mid green here, just sort of wet into wet, just sort of painting, not trying to disturb that wet paint underneath, if you see what I mean, just sort of brush strokes and then coming off. Add a little bit more cerulean in there to make it more of a blue green. I'm just varying those colours, loading my brush again, got a little bit more yellow on there, and just painting this large area here, which will become a lot darker. So adding some more yellow here. I really like these Daniel Smith pans. They're kind of semi-moist. A lot of the times when I use pans, they're quite sort of dry and you have to really work at them. Here you get instant colour. So I'm just mixing up here a little bit of ultramarine and a pinch of red. So I've got like a blue, violet, grey, wet into wet in the foreground. Mixing up quinacridone gold here with a pinch of that ultramarine, and just painting more damp into wet so the paint isn't as wet, so it doesn't travel as much. A little bit more ultramarine with the quinacridone gold. I love that colour combination. So it's a medium green here, and I'm working damp into wet there, adding a touch more of the ultramarine and quinacridone gold. And I'm kind of varying the greens. That's why I quite like mixing my colours up as I paint, because I get lots of variety. But if this is too much for you, you can watch this video, make some notes, and then mix up your colours in advance and then start painting. Especially if you are starting out in watercolour, it can be helpful. Painting the tree here, I'm using burnt sienna and ultramarine, damp into damp now. Make sure it's not too wet, because otherwise that will bleed out into your foliage. If it does, use your paper towel, as what I'm doing here, to wipe the edges. I'm using some table salt to sprinkle onto the damp paint. I'm going to allow that to dry naturally for the salt to absorb the paint to create some lovely light textures. And here are the lovely light textures. They look amazing, don't they? What I'm doing now is I'm spattering masking fluid. I've dipped the brush into liquid hand soap to protect the brush while I use the masking fluid, and I'm spattering it onto the dry surface. And I'm going to allow that to dry naturally. If you use any heat on masking fluid, it's very tricky to remove. So the masking fluid has dried, and I am using some wax resist on the fence here to the right hand side and on some of the posts here to create texture, and it's to reserve that light colour underneath as well. Do practice using wax, because sometimes you have to press harder on certain papers and not so hard on others. So I am mixing up quinacridone gold and phthalo green. I did put a pinch of ultramarine in there. So I've made plenty of paint and I'm spritzing this area with clean water. I'm going to work section by section, which I hope will help you, especially stopping the painting from drying out. And I'm going to work damp into wet, or damp into damp. So I'm using a size 8 round brush and I am tickling this beautiful colour onto the surface of the paper, trying to avoid some of the salt area as well. I'll keep some, but I'll paint over others. Salt's quite random, so I just wanted to have that light texture from the salt as well. So I'm going to work my way around the painting now, tickling on this paint, working damp into damp. I'm keeping the light areas here as well. There's a little bit of light there, and I'm just varying my greens as well. A little bit more yellow, touch more green. I'm using a touch of the burnt sienna now with some of the Jane's grey. You can use Paynes grey. And I'm painting the tree now. It's pretty much dry actually, but it's kind of damp into damp using that size 8 round brush. The tree is silhouetted against that light background, so it really comes forward. And I'm painting it all the way to the top, but I'm sort of leaving gaps and sort of zigzagging my brush to make it look more natural as the foliage sort of comes in front there. You can see I'm doing it here, zigzaggy marks on top of the foliage. So some of the foliage comes forward, but I'm painting over the top of it as well. I'm spritzing again just to soften everything there to make it look more natural. Mixing up some ultramarine here with a little bit of the quinacridone gold. It's really dark and I'm just painting damp into damp, building up these sort of washes here, creating sort of darker marks because the foliage is silhouetted in this area. But I also want that sort of lighter greens as well. So I'm working here, damp into damp at the top. There's this lovely sort of greens here coming down the centre of the painting. I must admit, I did think later maybe I should have left this area completely light, and that's something that you can decide as well. But at the moment I'm just going along with the photograph, just adding this slightly different green. You can add the phthalo green or even phthalo blue to sort of change your greens. You get brighter greens and sort of more garish greens almost when you use phthalo blues or greens. With the ultramarine you get more of a realistic looking green, and it's because ultramarine's got little red particles, pigment in there, and it just sort of in a way muddies the green, but it's sort of like adding brown or red to your colour, so it neutralizes it a little bit so you don't get such bright greens. So just adding sort of shapes here and just sort of adding some water as well just to dilute this colour. I want this to remain pale, the area just above the post there, but I'm also painting in the sort of gaps between the posts here quite loosely with a yellow green, wet on dry pretty much there, so I don't want it to spread too much on the fence posts. Adding a little bit more of a blue green just above there, adding a touch more blue, and then just softening and blending with a clean wet brush. So you can see I'm quite a loose painter. And I always feel actually that you're going to go on with darker colours with the posts. So this is quite a sort of very loose style with the foliage, and you give the structure with the posts once it's dry in the next stage. So just adding a little bit of green in the foreground there, touch more of the phthalo blue and burnt sienna, adding darks now, damp into damp on top of this already dark colour. So as you can see, you can build up layers even when you're working wet into wet. You don't have to wait for it to dry. So I'm tickling the paint on, as you can see, loosely painting, trying to get really kind of natural looking marks. Adding a little bit more dark to the centre of that tree using the grey, and a little bit more dark to the foliage to the left. I'm just adding a little bit of dark here. There's a little bush just beside the fence post here, so it comes forward away from the background, and a few more darker grasses, damp into damp, using the tip of my brush there. Adding some more yellow green here, so I'm painting this in the lighter areas of the trees here, but it's quite a light colour. I don't want to go too dark here. I need to keep my light, so it's just a yellow green, and I'm pretty much painting this wet on dry. If you're worried about doing that, you can give it a spritz with your spritzer bottle. So a little bit more ultramarine here to the right hand side. I forgot to spritz it, so I'm just spritzing that area. It does make painting foliage a little bit easier, especially if you're a beginner. So just painting the foliage here as well, trying to be really random, creating all these different marks. And I must say it's a really good exercise in brush marks, creating all these different sort of sizes of leaves, etc. So I'm going to paint the fence here, and I am using burnt sienna. You can see how the wax has resisted the paint there to create texture and light on the fence. So this is wet on dry using my size 8 brush. I've just got a little bit of green here. I'm just painting it at the bottom of the fence there to make it look like it's in the ground and more natural. And I'm just sprinkling a little bit more salt onto the damp paint again to create light textures. Mixing up some more yellow green here, and I'm spattering it just sort of here and there, especially in the center where there's more lighter greens. This is the mid green, so I'm spattering this pretty much wet into wet. And I'm spattering a darker green now. You can use the phthalo blue with quinacridone gold or burnt sienna, and I'm spattering that wet into wet, especially in those dark areas. And it's a nice way of painting foliage without using your brush. You can also use a sponge as well. Mixing up another sort of mid-green using the quinacridone gold, some of the yellow, and I'm spattering in the foreground. I've just turned my painting to the side. Got a little bit of blue in there as well. Any blue will do. Just keep those greens changing, keep using different greens. It makes it more exciting and more interesting. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. What I'm doing now is I'm brushing off all the salt, and I'm also going to remove the masking fluid. I'm using tape to do this because the masking fluid will stick to the tape and it takes it off cleanly. You can use a putty rubber or even your thumb. So once the masking fluid is removed, you can see it's created lots of light in the foliage especially. What I'm doing now is I am mixing up a little bit of the grey and the burnt sienna and ultramarine, nice dark colour. Wet on dry, I'm using my reservoir brush. You can use a rigger or a small round brush, whichever brush you feel comfortable with to make thin lines. So I really like these reservoir brushes because it holds lots of water in the main part of the brush, and then you've got this rigger part that comes through the centre that gives you those lovely thin lines. Do take your time with this. There aren't too many branches to deal with, but it really does bring your painting to life. It gives these trees structure, and as you can see straight away, the sort of background recedes now and these branches come forward, and it creates depth in the painting. And I love the way that foliage behind looks so atmospheric now, and I'm really pleased with the masking fluid and the salt for creating texture. So I'm just painting the branches here to the left, wet on dry. So mixing up some burnt sienna here with the grey, and I am painting the tree trunk here, which I've actually used some wax resist as well on there. I put the wax over the previous wash, so I'm reserving that sort of lighter grey, and I'm just sort of finessing the edge of the tree trunk there as well, just smoothing it out. I want to bring it forward so it comes away from that background and creates depth in my painting. Or a synthetic sponge, but I'm painting directly onto that sponge with yellow paint, and I'm tapping very gently the surface of the paper to create some light foliage. It's a great way of adding light, especially if you've lost your light. I'm mixing up a darker green now using my size 8 brush with phthalo blue, and you could use quinacridone gold or yellow, so it's a really lovely luscious dark green. I'm just swiping that sponge into that, and then I'm tapping really gently. Don't press too hard, you'll just get a splodge. So just very gently you get these lovely textured marks. I'm only putting them there, here and there. I don't want to overdo this. I just want to sort of create texture that comes forward away from those softer marks that I painted earlier, and that will create depth in my painting. Don't you just love watercolour? I love all these techniques. It's the magic of watercolour. So just adding a little bit more of that mid to dark green, and I'm just tapping it here and there just to create that foliage. I am using a little bit of raw sienna mixed with burnt sienna. I'm painting wet on dry using my size 8 brush. You can see how the wax has resisted the watercolour there. I'm adding some green as well. The fence post has got lots of different sort of colours in there, so I'm trying to be creative and also to create harmony in my painting. So you can drop the colours that you've used for your foliage wet into wet, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm just sort of carefully painting this first larger post, and I'm going to continue on painting the smaller posts wet on dry, and then dropping in colours wet into wet, using mostly the ultramarine and burnt sienna for the darker colours, and a little bit of that green and raw sienna for the lighter shades. So again, using the ultramarine and burnt sienna, quite creamy, painting damp into damp, some of the darks there on the left there. And rinsing my brush again, a little bit more burnt sienna, touch of the green as well, painting some of these slats here, wet on dry. You can see again how the wax has resisted the paint there. So it's quite nice, it creates some textures. So just mixing up a little bit more of the ultramarine with a pinch of the burnt sienna, painting this darker post wet on dry. A few sort of markings just here and there. And isn't it amazing now when you look, this comes forward and that lovely light background recedes. So I'm just sort of finessing these marks here, just tidying up the edges using my brush. So again, getting some more of that raw sienna and painting some of the verticals here, quite paler colour, wet on dry, and then adding some darks to the left hand side, damp into damp. I love how I've just sort of brush my brush through the ultramarine and burnt sienna to mix them literally from the pans, and adding some darks here, damp into damp on the top of the pose, just a few little darks here and there. So not only am I sort of painting the darks, but I'm also tidying up the edges as well. I think there's a sign on this post here, so I'm just giving some information without going into too much detail, wet on dry. Painting in some foliage here, just to the left hand side. There's a little bush there, so I'm just painting wet on dry, a few little leaves, and then mixing the burnt sienna and the grey, using the reservoir brush, a little bit more of the grey, and I'm just sort of painting some twigs there, just sort of painting sort of lots of little grasses around the posts, and it really grounds them and makes them look like they're sort of been put into the ground and not balancing on the ground. Vary the lengths of the grasses and do vary the colours. It just looks so much more interesting to look at. And as you can see, it creates a foreground, the details come forward, and again it creates depth in your painting. So gone back to my size 8 round brush, I'm using some burnt sienna and ultramarine. I'm just painting a little bit more darks now underneath to create some shadows, using a little bit of the green as well so the colour is more interesting, and just sort of creating these darks, make the post look more solid looking and more 3D. So I'm just going to paint a few grasses just in the middle distance here, wet on dry, using the quinacridone gold with a pinch of the phthalo green, but you could use ultramarine. And I've softened them as well with a clean damp brush. I want them to be fuzzy, but I want something to be there so it's not completely sort of just pale. Otherwise that will stand out. So I'm using my size 8 brush and I'm painting sort of almost a dry brush effect, using the belly of the brush, some of the burnt sienna here, wet on dry to create colour and texture. I'm mixing up the ultramarine and the burnt sienna now and painting that damp into damp now, sort of scrubbing it on to create the look of that fence to the right hand side. A touch more of the grey there. I'm just sort of blending that with a wet brush there just to push it back a little bit more of that ultramarine. You can see it's starting to look more solid. So I am mixing up some of the phthalo green with the yellow, and I'm going to spatter this lovely limey green colour just here and there on to the damp surface or to the dry surface and into the foreground as well. A little bit more yellow I want here. So bright yellow colour, it really stands out and glows and comes forward, and it also creates light as well. So you can have some real fun spattering these colours to create even more texture onto the surface here. I'm mixing up here ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I'm wetting the foreground with clean water, and I'm just painting that colour sort of wet into wet to create some shadows on the foreground there, and just pushing that up into the grasses on the left and right as well to make it look more natural. I am painting some shadows on the fence here using ultramarine with a pinch of red, painting damp into damp, and it's just a nice way of sort of pushing that fence back a little bit as well. I'm using my reservoir brush, a little bit more ultramarine with the Alizarin crimson. I'm doing the same on the posts as well and across the grasses, so it looks like sort of shadows from the foliage above, just here and there. Just adding a few little twigs and branches here just to the right using the reservoir brush, and adding a few more branches in the trees above using the grey, adding a touch more water into that grey just to loosen it up a little bit, and just put these very thin branches going into that lighter green there. It kind of leads your eye as well into the painting. I thought it'd be quite nice just to paint a few darker branches just above here, because that's the kind of foreground. They're the branches that are nearest. So a few more here and there, just to tie everything together and to create more detail, more interest in the foreground. And I'm just using my size 8 brush, clean damp brush, just to lift off some light on the top of the post there, and using my paper towel to lift off the excess paint to create light, the light coming from above. And I'm finishing off with a spatter in the foreground. And I'm removing the washi tape to reveal a lovely white border, and here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.